Slavery played a big part in Southern America during the early 1800s. They were used for cotton labor. The slaves were unpaid and normally worked nonstop. Of course, there were many people who wanted to stop slavery. They were called abolitionists. Captain John Brown was an extreme abolitionist willing to go beyond the boundary line to get his opinions and anti-slavery thoughts out there. He wasn't like other abolitionists during his time. Brown didn't just idly stand to the side and say slavery was bad. John Brown took action. He massacred pro-slavery supporters in several towns, put fear in people's eyes, and gathered groups of men to join him on his raids. His intentions were right and noble. As John Brown predicted, and after his failed raid, it would take a war to end slavery.
John Brown was born May 9, 1800, and grew up practicing the Calvinist Christian religion in Torrington, Connecticut. He knew all men are created equal, and no one should own another person. When Brown was a boy, his family would discourage any idea he might have had about slavery. In fact, when Brown was a child, he worked with a slave owner and had to acknowledge the horrors of slavery firsthand. The memory of the poor slave getting beaten with a shovel was forever etched into Brown's mind for years to come. In a way, that was what made John Brown get the idea to demolish slavery.
Well, John Brown is born in 1800 into a very religious family in New England, and he is raised in a kind of strong Old Testament kind of Christianity, and with a great hatred of slavery from his earliest years.
In 1854, politicians from both the Union side and the Confederate side met in Topeka, Kansas to discuss popular sovereignty over the war to abolish slavery. In a heated debate, Republican Senator Charles Sumner took matters into his own hands and called out the authors of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Stephen A. Douglas and Andrew Butler. This quickly led to the event of Bleeding Congress, in which Butler's nephew, Preston Brooks, beat Sumner to the ground with a cane. The 2-year war known as Bleeding Kansas started. In this war, one of the major attacks was led by John Brown. This was the Pottawatomie Massacre. Brown and 40 other men led an attack on Pottawatomie Creek. Brown killed 5 people in one night and caused him and his army to rack up a total of 29 more kills over the span of 3 months. The wars lasted over 2 years until Kansas became an anti-slavery state.
Kansas is the result of a lot of tension over the question of whether or not Kansas would be admitted as a state that allowed slavery or prohibited slavery. There was an enormous amount of dissent and disagreement about this in Congress, including an incident in which a congressman from South Carolina beat a senator from Massachusetts with a cane on the floor of the Senate, which actually precipitated a sense that there would be violence that couldn't be contained. But Bleeding Kansas, interestingly enough, happens almost in the same week as that beating in the Senate. But people aren't necessarily communicating back and forth. This is a time of the telegraph, but no internet, no telephone. So it starts with the sack of Lawrence, which is an attack on Lawrence, which is the pro-slavery state capital. And then John Brown, who is a radical anti-slavery activist, in response to that, decides to take justice into his own hands and creates his own what's called the Pottawatomie Massacre, where he, in the middle of the night, murders, I think, 5 men by cleaving them from, to use the biblical or the Shakespearean term, from the nave to the chops with a broadsword, where basically he cuts them from the belly button to the head. And this creates basically civil war in Kansas that lasts from May until late October.
Brown also created another massacre in an unsuspecting town of Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Harpers Ferry is a small town in a valley surrounded by hills. It was a pro-slavery town, and Brown's idea of attacking it was so that there would be a slave uprising. He wanted slaves to take a stand against their masters and kill them. On October 16, 1859, Brown had improvised and gathered 21 men, 5 were black and 16 were white, and captured a train on its way to Harper's Ferry. When the train arrived at the small town, all men got off and allowed the train to move forward for an unknown reason. First, they decided to take hold of the armory. The armory was low maintenance with little guards, so it seemed to be the great place to take hold of. After attacking the guards, they gathered the supplies they needed to begin the actual raid. Brown and his 21 other men rushed to the town and practically tore it apart. They captured a handful of hostages, killed 6 civilians, and wounded 9 in the act. Word started to spread throughout the town that there would be a slave uprising conducted by Captain John Brown. In the early mornings of the next day, October 17, 1859, U.S. Marines arrived. They were led by the soon-to-be Confederate leader Robert E. Lee and Lieutenant J.E.B. Stuart. Brown realized that all possible escape routes were blocked off, so he decided to take shelter in a firehouse. Colonel Robert E. Lee and Lieutenant J.E.B.'s soldiers closed in on the abolitionists, forcing them to surrender.
General thing that happens is that many Southerners decide that they need to take their protection into their own hands, and so they form a whole slew of new state militia groups where they train and arm young men to protect against slave insurrection. But actually, one of the things this does is it means that the South is much more prepared for civil war in the spring of 1861 than the North is, where those same activities haven't been going on.
On December 2, 1859, John Brown was hung in present-day Charleston, West Virginia, for treason against slavery and slave supporters. His most famous action was the raid on Harper's Ferry. In his final speech, he said, "I, John Brown, am not quite certain that the crimes of the guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it must be done." John Brown predicted and influenced the Civil War, even after his death. In 1861, the Civil War started, finishing what Brown fought hard for.
That he becomes a kind of touchstone for Northerners about the ways in which compromise is no longer possible, and therefore they're fighting a just war, and that God is on their side.
John Brown has had a major effect on today's society. Since his raids, his action has inspired many people to come forward and fight slavery. After the Civil War, slavery was officially abolished, though in future years segregation became more common across the country. People saw what Brown did and took a more peaceful approach while addressing this situation. He's unlike many people today because his take on equal rights was aggressive, while many movements today, such as Black Lives Matter, stay more towards the peaceful approach. John Brown's legacy will forever be imprinted into the history of the United States of America.
So he's celebrated, I think, by Northerners at least, as a hero and a martyr to the cause of anti-slavery. Southerners obviously don't find him to be a compelling or important person in that way, but they remember him as kind of the evidence of the most dangerous kind of implications of abolitionist activity and the justification for secession.